Hello. In this third video for week 3, we'll look at how scholars have approached audience studies, with a view to giving context to the next video in which we consider how audience studies are changing and what tools we can take from the past to consider the future. Why should we study audiences? You could say that this is the most important aspect of communication studies. Without an audience, is there any communication at all? At its most basic level, communication is about a sender and receiver. Someone sends a message, and at the other end, someone else receives this message. Between sending and receiving, there might be something that transports this message, the channel. And in this process, the message might be changed or moderated or produced in some ways by what we know as a medium or media in the plural form. In terms of media studies, we are interested in knowing who receives media texts, what they do with them, and how this might change the way they live, for better or worse, or the way they think. Much of the study on audience draws on influential ideas of media effects, that is, the potential of media and communications flows to produce behavioral effects on people. This is the field of media effects, a traditional and quite old way of doing media studies that asks, what do media do to people? Media effects research is still the basis for much or even most media and communications research and analysis. This is true whether it is scholars at universities doing this research or professionals at communications companies or other interested parties such as lobby groups. Effects research remains, however, quite a difficult and elusive field. It's always hard to gather evidence on how audiences actually think. People are complex beings. Even our own ideas of what we are thinking, feeling, or believing might change from one way to the next. They are also not just tied to their media and communications, but may be formed by myriad other variables in their lives. We can go back to ideology in connection with audience research. Ideology is circulated via media texts and social institutions, and ideologies that become normalized do so because they are repeated in different and subtle ways in a range of media texts and sustained by socializing agencies. Remember what we heard earlier, that ideology is embedded in common sense cultural beliefs or assumptions about the way things are. So, as we discussed, once an ideology has become common knowledge or normalized, it is no longer questioned by the majority of people. We could say that all media texts are ideological to a certain extent. That is, they all contain certain systems of ideas that we supposedly relate to. Much of our media also serve to continually reinforce society's ideologies. That's why it's important to study media, so we can work out how the media is doing this and in whose interests it is. Usually it's whoever has the power and the money to control and own media, as we explored in week 2 in our discussions of political economy. And we also want to find out what the effects of this media are on audiences. In this video, I'll summarize some of the main theoretical approaches of audience studies. We're going to look at the effects model, also known as the hypodermic or bullet model, the uses and gratifications model, encoding, decoding, and cultural approaches. As always, of course, this is only a brief summary, an introduction to some models of audience research that you might consider during your degree when you are studying, critically analysing, and doing media research yourself. Firstly, the effects model. This is one of the oldest theories of audience research. The effects model often uses quantitative research methods, that is, counting items and drawing conclusions based on patterns, such as you might do in what is called a content analysis. But theorists have also contributed in a more abstract way, that is, not always providing the facts and figures that quantitative research generates. Instead, they use their theories and apply them to audience studies and carry out their research in a qualitative way. Many researchers in audience research combine qualitative and quantitative research, and this is called triangulation. An example of a very important group of theorists from history is the Frankfurt School in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. These researchers theorized on the effects of German propaganda in film and radio from a neo-Marxist point of view. Many of them left Germany before or even during the war, and they had a big influence in the US. There, in the 1950s and 60s, researchers examined the effect on viewers of violence on TV, to give just one example. The effects model emphasizes what the mass media does to its audience. So it says the power lies with the message generated by the medium, rather than with the audience. In this one-way theory, the media injects the audience with its message, and the audience is then more or less affected by the drug, i.e. the message, depending on how strong it is. Although it's an old theory, it's still very commonly used, so much so that its precepts are often assumed. How often have you heard it expressed, for example, that various types of media are playing to the lowest common denominator, or that they are dumbing down the population? We can see that this theory and this approach assumes that the power of the media is negative, not positive. For example, the media is blamed for causing moral panics, for promoting mindless consumerism, for producing couch potatoes who spend all their time in front of the TV, or people who are addicted to playing video games and who are adversely affected by what they see on their screens. Popular topics for research include behaviorism, looking at how social behavior is affected by media, particularly that of children, and whether violent media content influences real-life behavior. Social learning theory is related to another area, that is, the idea that we learn patterns of behavior by watching and imitating others. As I said, the theory says that mass media negatively affects behavior. So, violent video games have often been blamed for influencing people to commit violent crimes. This is an example of one of the most often used in a pseudo-research or pop psychology way. You can see it when there is a mass shooting in the US, for example, and the media can connect the shooter to being a video game player or watching violent movies. Much of the media reports on this sort of connection are based on very old research filtered down over decades, or on non-scholarly methods of research, or even on conjecture or opinion. It's actually extremely difficult for researchers to prove without doubt that a violent video game makes a violent person. But it sounds like this could be the case. So in so-called common sense mass media, this is often what is presented as something that is a fact. Much of the reason why these ideas are so widespread can be attributed to one of the most famous studies of this type, Albert Bandura's original 1960s Bobo doll experiments, in which he discovered children would copy violence they saw enacted, whether it be in real life or on screens. If you want to see more about that, there's a link on the slide to a 2011 BBC documentary about the Bobo doll experiments. You'll find the PowerPoint slides on Moodle in the week 3 content. The next model we'll look at is the uses and gratifications model. If you've done any reading about audience theory at undergraduate level, you've probably heard of this one. It's a model that began in the US in the 1940s and became popular in the 1950s, and it focuses on audience needs rather than effects. It contradicts theories that emphasize negativity and pessimism about media. Instead, researchers question people on their TV watching habits and categorize them, for example, into personality types with supposedly particular needs. The uses and gratifications approach focuses on what audiences do with media products, rather than what media products do to them. In this way, it says the power lies with the consumer or the audience member who uses media for their own ends to gratify various needs and interests, both social and psychological. It also assumes the consumer has free will to choose the media products they want, and generally, theorists in this area are not interested in critiquing capitalist mass culture as effects theorists, such as those in the Frankfurt School were. This theory is still widely used and it continues to evolve. For example, some recent developments include research into fans and cult viewers. Think of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, where people dress up and go every week in a kind of cult, a ritualized cult, and know all the dance steps which they do in the aisles during the screening of the film. The picture on the slide, by the way, was actually another level on from that. It's of a reenactment of what Rocky Horror audiences do for audiences watching the 1980 movie Fame. Another example is a globalization approach to look at how different cultures use various media products. This approach would be of particular interest to us in this unit. Critics of this theory include that it assumes media can satisfy needs. Thus, the theory is a defense of an argument often used by media operators to defend their product, that is, that they are giving the people what they want. But who decides what they want? And do media really give them what they want? Or does what the media feed them influence them into thinking it was what they wanted all along? For example, I doubt that many people had said, I wish there was a TV competition that would set up fake marriages between people who didn't know each other and that it could be called Married at First Sight. Now we'll look at encoding decoding as a theoretical approach. This is empirical investigation and critical analysis of human social structure, a type of audience research that started in the 1970s as a result of the work of the British theorist Stuart Hall, who we've mentioned before. It's been hugely influential on the way audience research has been conducted since the 1980s. Hall's approach involves examining encoding of media into media texts by their producers and decoding or determining meaning in media texts by the audience, rather than considering the audience as passive as the effects model does. It's a complex approach that also considers the possibility that audiences can actively challenge the intended meaning in texts, and that there is more than one meaning in every text. This is referred to as polysemy. Hall's encoding-decoding model considered production, circulation, distribution, consumption, and reproduction. This led to considerations of genre, discourse, and domestic social contexts in relation to the way audiences view media texts. In his reception theory, Hall related audience responses to three categories. The first was the dominant hegemonic position, that is, audience responses that are expected or predictable or serve a dominant ideology. The second was the negotiated position, that is, when dominant ideas are largely accepted by an audience, But audience members also come up with variations from the accepted premise. And thirdly, the oppositional position. That is when audience members outrightly reject a position and take up a different one in opposition. A key criticism of this branch of theory is that making assumptions from a small group you have surveyed, then applying those assumptions to the whole of a population is a problematic limitation. And results may not be indicative of actual audience habits beyond the controlled experiment. In addition, determining the intended meaning of an encoded message may be subjective. And fourthly, we're looking at cultural approaches. This is a more recently developed approach to audience research that looks at ethnographies or fieldwork research. This approach comes from anthropology, which means it often uses participant observation methods of research, where the researcher participates in the lives of groups to be studied. Understandably, this type of research usually involves a small sample and relatively shorter time span than other types of research. So critics debate its usefulness to audience studies as a whole. Research includes cultural respect by providing life histories, case studies, and verbatim quotations from subjects. And in this way, it can be extremely useful. This approach can trace its origins to the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who looked at how shared knowledge, known as cultural competencies, is not equally shared in society. He also looked at how some types of culture have a higher status than others, referred to as high and low culture. This can be applied to any media product, but consider TV, for instance. So the more often considered observation of contemporary soaps and game shows and reality shows that they are of a lower status than news programs, period dramas, and documentaries. Or think of music, the idea that opera and classical music somehow have a higher social status than pop music. Whether something is considered high or low culture can change with time. Shakespeare's plays, for example, were considered lowbrow entertainment in his lifetime, full of violence and rude jokes. This slide is just for your information, and you can access the slides yourself to look at it in more detail. A note about using older theoretical sources in your essay. It's fine to use the work of someone very influential in the field, even if it's a very old source. And it's a really good idea to read them in the original so you can see where the theory came from. However, you should also trace how it has evolved with modern theorists. That will be up to you to find research in journals and books to bring the research for your essay up to date. You'll also notice on the slides that I don't put the full reference as you would when formally referencing in an essay. This is so as not to clutter the slide. You should also be able to find these references by doing a search in the library catalogue or perhaps other online sources, but the library catalogue should be your first port of call. To finish this third section, let's briefly look at how academic research fits into the larger picture of professional audience studies. Audience research is done for many different reasons. Firstly, for academic study, particularly with regards to effects of media, e.g., do violent films make people violent? This is what we've looked at in most of this video. Also by government, lobby, and advocacy groups, particularly in relation to representation. They might want to find out, for example, if disabled people are represented as part of community life in locally made TV drama shows. For business reasons, primarily as rating statistics for advertising and product placement. by production companies and streaming services to determine what audiences want. One way to do this is by running focus groups. They're trying to find the answer to the question, what does the audience want? And for trend predictions. So professionals called futurists use this for commercial applications and purposes. This is because production often takes a while, usually years, between when you, say, think up an idea for a TV show or film and when you release it. What is popular this year may well not be what audiences want to see in 5 years, so someone needs to predict what audiences will want. Media companies now rely heavily on audience research and experts to help them predict what an audience will love or hate. As you would appreciate, it's a very inexact science, and they are wrong a lot of the time. Take the US pilots market as an example. This is where production companies showcase the first episode of a show they hope will be picked up by a network and funded for a full service. It's usually a once-a-year event, and many more pilots are turned down than are agreed to. And of those that do go to series, most fail and are cancelled after one series, proving that audiences are still elusive. There is no fail-safe way to tell what will be popular. If you work in the entertainment industry, you soon realise how important the gathering of information about audiences is, even if it's not an exact science. Media companies spend millions of dollars each year in the search of that elusive answer to the age-old question, who is the audience and what does it want? Information about audiences is central to media industries, as I've said, and also to product development and marketing. Thus, there is significant investment in audience research by communications and media industries, and there are large research-oriented companies specialising in this audience research. So, for example, we have OzTam, as pictured on the slide, which has meters in comparatively small samples of households around Australia to report their TV viewing. From that, OzTam researchers estimate the size of an audience for networks, individual programs, and in 5 major cities and nationally. These ratings have a major role in determining the price that can be charged for advertising. It's interesting, though, that the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, is included because it is wholly taxpayer funded and doesn't run ads. From small samples, they estimate the number of people who would have watched a show. The sample seems very small. There are only 5,250 households on the free-to-air viewing panels for the whole of Australia. In Melbourne itself, there are only 1,475 metres. And for subscription TV, there is a total of only 2,120 households for the whole of Australia. There is a lot of criticism of the way ratings are gathered, and a major limitation is the sample size. And yet, as OzTam says on its website, in terms of panel size relative to overall population, OzTam's panel is actually among the world's largest. That's all for Lecture 3.3. In the next video, we'll discuss active audience theories for the changing media world.